Please remember to like and subscribe for more fanfics. Enjoy.
Coil. By Allegory for Hatred, this is Book 2 of Magic and Mystery. All rights go to Allegory for Hatred. I do not own this story. 3 mice. Dazai blinked once, then twice. I'm not the villain here, he wanted to protest. But with the black shadow of the Port Mafia always hanging over him, Dazai wasn't entirely sure that was true. Still, Dazai was convinced that, at the very least, Lockhart was no champion of the people. The man had yet to go even a full minute without finding some way to compliment himself. At least when Draco boasted his prowess, the snake didn't immediately follow it up with a declaration of war. Lockhart looked incredibly pleased with himself. Dazai wanted little more than to shatter that self-satisfied expression. But he knew he needed to maintain some level of restraint here with Lucius watching. With everyone watching. Damn Mori for not giving him a heads up. No, damn Mori for letting things get this far. Dazai was sure the doctor could have shaken off the Daily Prophet somehow. It was almost like he wanted the demon student story to spread its fingers through the cracks of magical society. Everyone here was terrified of him, and they were angry about it. What was the best solution here? Dazai usually had plenty of time to consider his schemes, and then when he executed them it would be done methodically and often from the shadows. Now Dazai would have to do so on the fly with a sizable audience. Mori would call it a good challenge. Dazai would call it annoying. Deciding on his plan of action, Dazai gave the crowd a rigid smile. There is no monster here to defeat, Lockhart. Why don't you defeat you-know-who and write a book on that instead? Dazai asked coyly. At the last second, he remembered to change Voldemort's name to its censored version. Even with the switch, however, quite a few faces in the audience flinched back as though struck. That must be more interesting to your readers than you beating up a 12-year-old child. Lockhart's smile was beginning to look more like a grimace. Good. Nonsense. That vile man lives no longer. The only monster here is you. Dazai bristled minutely. Voldemort no longer? Then whose face had he glared down just a few months earlier? Keeping his cool demeanor, Dazai raised his hands in a placating gesture. Consider it, is all I mean. Anyway, I'm more likely to kill myself than you are to defeat me. Let's just call it a draw from the outset. For just a second, Dazai saw Lockhart's eyes narrow, like the man was trying to figure him out. However, it was replaced not a second after by another of his shining, fatuous smirks. You shouldn't lie about such things, he said with a scolding tongue. Taking a step forward, Lockhart approached Dazai. He couldn't help the way his body tensed up in anticipation, but he still made sure to keep his expression flat. The author came to a stop just a step away then, without indication, dropped his hand down onto Dazai's shoulder. He pulled Dazai, pressing the boy tightly into his side. The discomfort and disgust must have been palpable on Dazai's face because, a moment later, Lockhart lauded, "That's it! That's the front page photograph right there. Make sure to snap a couple. I can use one for the book cover once it's finished." There was a flash of light, and the sound of a camera shuddering from somewhere within in the crowd. Lockhart's hand was on his shoulder, pressing near his neck, and half the man's body was poking into him. Dazai wanted to stay rational, to grin and bear it, but the only thing he could think was get off, get off, get off, followed by the burning feeling of tar in the back of his throat. Dazai nearly choked on it. Remembered how Coil would do the same thing, how Mori still did. Subtly, he tried to pry himself out of Lockhart's grasp, but found he couldn't break free. Lockhart tugged him back to his side immediately. "Make a scary face for the photo," Lockhart told him. "My fans will eat that up. Like the one in the Daily Prophet articles if you could." Another photo taken, and another white flash to accompany it. "That image is cartoonish," Dazai bit out, largely ignoring Lockhart's demand. Still, Lockhart didn't let up. Dazai felt his skin sting wherever they touched. The man's body caged him in. Dazai's breath spiked. His discomfort rose and rose and rose and oomph! Dazai jammed his elbow into Lockhart's stomach. He was harsh, not sparing Lockhart any kindness. It connected with a thwump. Dazai was rewarded a second later when Lockhart stumbled and took a gasping breath for air. He wrapped his arms around his stomach and grunted. Someone clicked a photo. Relieved to have the other man off of him, Dazai took a calculated step away. It still burned where they had touched, but the tight band around Dazai's chest finally released. Almost immediately, he staggered into Fred and George. The twins looked down at him with surprised eyes, looking like they hadn't quite processed the latest string of events yet. "He attacked me," Lockhart cried out. "The demon student has attempted to kill me as well, just like poor Quirinus Quirrell." A shriek rang out in the crowd and Dazai's head snapped towards it. Lockhart did the same. Whereas Dazai's look was frazzled, Lockhart was the picture of a wounded knight. "Not to worry, people," he assured. Despite his confident words, however, Lockhart backed away from Dazai with a wary glance. "I won't be defeated so easily." "But ahem," he coughed, again moving closer to the crowd and further from Dazai. "I believe it would be best to return to the book signing now, before our demon student gets more, violent." Dazai watched, with mute curiosity, as Lockhart stumbled back through the crowd before, unceremoniously throwing himself onto a chair. Was he being serious? Lockhart waited in patient silence, before, after nearly a minute, a young curly-haired boy offered out a book. Lockhart signed it with a flourish. Slowly the rest of the crowd began to gather around him, though not without giving Dazai a sharp glance or two first. Dazai stared. Had this so-called champion of the people just run away after barely taking one hit? Disbelief sat thick in Dazai's stomach as he tried to reconcile the boisterous Lockhart from before to the fidgety one now. Helpless, Dazai looked over his shoulders to see what the Weasley twins thought. They looked just as lost as him. The second their eyes met, however, Fred and George shook from their stupor. Then, mostly to himself, Dazai muttered, "Did he really just give up? It doesn't feel like I won at all." Fred hesitated for a second before seeming to come to some conclusion. He gently laid his hand on Dazai's shoulder and gave a light shove. He whispered, "Let's get out of here before Lockhart, thank you, George, decides he wants to start up round 2. Dazai glanced between them as he let them drag him away from the crowd. "I need to buy my books," he reminded the twins before they could take him too far. "Maybe come back another day?" George tried. Dazai was quick to disagree. With the number of photographers present today, his face would be even more widely known tomorrow. Fred sighed. "Let's be quick. I don't like the way those snotty fans were looking at you." After that, they worked to quickly and quietly collect all of Dazai's books. It was surprisingly easy to avoid the harsh glares of the other patrons, but not without reason. They were clearly avoiding him. When Dazai turned down an aisle, he abruptly found the lane emptied of people within seconds. It didn't bother him, but the twins grew more distressed with each and every aisle. Plucking the biology of magic from the shelf, he tried to console them. "You two are overreacting." The twins huffed, evidently in disagreement over the topic. They read over Dazai's book list before pulling a face. "What?" "Lockhart's books are the only thing left," George explained, a furrow in his brow. "Want us to sneak up front and grab them?" Fred offered. At their hesitance, Dazai remembered that Lockhart's books were only at the front of the shop by the man himself. Dazai considered accepting their offer. It would keep him out of the crowd and stop Lockhart from starting anything up again. But an idea flashed in Dazai's head. "I have a better plan," he said, grinning. Fred and George blinked. Then, twin smirks grew across their lips as well. "That's an impish grin if we've ever seen one." "What are you thinking, boss?" "I'm thinking," Dazai said, striding across the store floor towards the front. "I want Lockhart to sign my books." The twins snorted. Though clearly amused with the idea, they sobered up quickly. "Is that a smart idea?" "Yeah," Fred sniffed. "I'm all for bullying Lockhart, but he has a whole mob backing him up." Lockhart definitely didn't seem to have any qualms about threatening a child. But from Dazai's perspective, very few people did. Lockhart wasn't special in that regard, just look at Quirrell. And even though Dazai loathed butting through crowds, he knew there were other considerations to take into account, namely, the Malfoy family. Mori had said to make a good impression. Running and hiding from that sparkly, blonde narcissist wasn't a good impression by a long shot. It said, "Port Mafia is a bunch of good-for-nothing cowards. He might as well consider the mission failed now." Mori had also said that fear was a good motivator. And certainly, everyone currently in Flourish and Blots was absolutely petrified of Dazai. Even Lockhart, it seemed, and Dazai could work with that. Dazai needed the last word. The twins must have noticed something in his expression because they didn't protest further. Instead, they just hovered over his shoulders. It was a familiar feeling, to have Fred and George within reach again. Dazai walked to the front, ignoring how the crowd backed away from him. As he walked, he snatched some of Lockhart's books from the surrounding tables. The twins did the same, dropping them into Dazai's open arms after. People moved aside. Some flinched as he approached. Wide, fearful eyes followed him. Then, Dazai came to an abrupt halt. Lockhart was sitting behind a long white table. There was an open book in front of him with half a signature across it, as though Dazai had chased a customer away mid-signing. A dangerous smirk flew across Dazai's lips. Lockhart's mouth fell open. Someone snapped a photo. Without ceremony, Dazai dropped his entire stack of books with a woody smack. A few people flinched at the sound, including Lockhart. Dazai took no small amount of pleasure in seeing this. "Could you sign these for me, please?" he said sweetly. Lockhart's brows rose all the way to his hairline. He coughed to clear his throat before pasting a charming smile across his face. His teeth gleamed white. "Come to taunt me, demon?" Dazai held his smile in place. Having instigated this conversation himself, he felt much more in control. No more was he caught off guard by the dozens of eyes boring holes into him. "I've come to get my books signed by the man who's going to kill me." He said the words like they were the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. And they kind of were. Dazai leaned forward, bracing his palms against the table. He spoke just low enough for only Lockhart to hear. "Keep your enemies close, right?" "Fear," Dazai's eyes said. "You should fear me." A hush fell across the crowd. Lockhart met Dazai's eyes with two wide ones of his own. His brows seemed to raise even higher and higher. Dazai didn't relent, not stepping back even when he was practically nose-to-nose with the man. Asking like this is awfully rude, though I suppose we can't expect better from a mindless killer," Lockhart said. One of his hands found the quill forgotten on the table. With his other hand, he opened to the first page of one of the books. The quill tip poked into paper, then spelled out a large and loopy Lockhart. Dazai finally leaned away with a satisfied nod. "Thanks. The other ones too, if you wouldn't mind." Lockhart's head snapped up to glare, but at the last minute he remembered his audience and stopped himself. Instead, a tight but otherwise charming smile filled his face. Of course, anything for a fan. Dazai watched as Lockhart signed one book, then the next. The entire bookstore was dead silent. A tense air seemed to surround them. The crowd was stiff and unmoving, as if expecting either Dazai or Lockhart to attack the other at any moment. Dazai smiled a toothy thing, and Lockhart did as he was told. As Lockhart finished signing the final book, neither had done any more than to simply smile. Boldly written across the cover page of Break with a Banshee, Lockhart was writing a swirling. "To my latest victory in a long line of truly impressive victories. May your defeat be as devastating for you as it is triumphant for me, Lockhart." The book cover snapped shut. Dazai placed his hand on the book, then slid it to himself. He added it to the stack, and hauled the entire thing into his arms. It was heavy, but Dazai didn't let that show on his face. Instead, he gave Lockhart a fox-like smile. "Thank you," he grinned. Lockhart's beatific smile looked a little strained, which only made Dazai's grin widen cheekily. Dazai stepped away, content with how the interaction had resolved. Purposefully, he walked to the front desk to pay for his books. The worker there shakily rang him up. Dazai was very aware that every eye in the shop was on him now, carefully watching his every move. As he placed a calculated handful of sickles and galleons on the desk, Dazai caught Lucius's eye over the crowd. The blonde stared back at him, expression perfectly blank except for a thoughtful press of his lips. Dazai smirked, but otherwise didn't gesture to the man. He didn't want to call too much attention to their relationship for now. In the meantime, "Your books, sir?" the cashier said. She didn't seem to know how to address him, Dazai thought with amusement. He collected the books from her. Now they were nicely tied together and bagged for easier carry. Dazai hauled them into his arms, then turned to leave. Although he was a little forlorn at not being able to hang out with the twins any longer, Dazai knew it was for the best. Tensions were high in Flourish and Blots right now, and Dazai was already public enemy first. The Weasleys didn't need to be dragged into that any more than they already would be. Thinking this, Dazai walked straight out the exit. Draco and the twins would have to finish shopping on their lonesome, it seemed. He supposed ice cream would have to wait. "That's right, be gone from here," Lockhart called from behind him. A second of prolonged silence passed. Then, the crowd started to jeer with him. Dazai merely raised his hand in a casual goodbye. "See you in class, Professor." A bell on the door jingled as it shut. Quiet. The wind brushed Dazai's hair back gently. His bag swayed in the breeze. The streets of Diagon Alley held none of the tension inside Flourish and Blots. Unknowing to what had just transpired, pedestrians casually chatted and shopped. Dazai eyed them, as if expecting someone to recognize him any second now. But after a few seconds, the peaceful air of the streets did nothing but hum with faint magic. Dazai let out a breath. Now would be a good time to scurry back to the leaky cauldron. Now, before any of those photographers could rush to publish their stories. Once Dazai's face was plastered across the news, Diagon Alley could become too hostile to traverse. But first, Dazai looked down at his unoccupied hand. He flipped it over, inspecting the exposed palm mutely. No longer human seemed to buzz beneath his skin and boil in his blood. There was something else he needed to buy first. Tom had a problem. For once, his problem wasn't the rowdy drunkard at the bar, nor the snooty wizards currently making an unapologetic mess of rooms 6 through 9, nor the mysterious owl that kept leaving dead mice on his doorstep. No, all of that was too straightforward to really be a problem at this point. The problem was that the 12-year-old boy staying in room number 4 was a murderer. Tom had had his fair share of unusual and dangerous customers in the past. Running the leaky cauldron for as many years as he had, it was inevitable. During the height of the Wizarding War, sketchy people passed through nearly every day. Tom was used to witnessing danger in passing. He played unobtrusive host when he could manage, and a victor when he had to. Tom knew what he was doing, and he always knew where to draw the line. But something about Dazai Osamu was different. Eyeing the newsstand near the wall, Tom sighed. "What are you sighing about?" A particular customer at the bar slurred, leaning over their ale. "Heavy. If I were surrounded by alcohol all day, I'd never be sad." Tom raised a brow. "If you were surrounded by alcohol all day, you would never get anything done. Well." They waved a hand, then tucked their long dark hair behind an ear self-consciously. "I wouldn't get anything done anyway." "Snot in my nature." "You can't be drinking so early in the day, Florence," Tom interrupted, despite having been the one to serve them. As if fearing the worst, they wrapped a hand around their drink and hugged it protectively to their chest. "Spell of de-intoxicating," Florence grumbled. "When you finally invent such a spell," Tom said sternly, "you'll be famous. In the meantime, you'll just be going into work slurring all your words." "Ha! As if the Daily Prophet notices the difference," they cackled. "All the big boss cares about is those fancy journalists upstairs. I doubt the boss even remembers us lowly workers in the archive. It's all demon student this, demon student that these days." Tom sniffed. Without a word, he turned away to collect an empty plate from another group of customers. They gave him their thanks, then left for Diagon Alley. When Tom returned his attention to Florence, the patron was taking another long swig of ale. "Slow down," Tom said, earning a glare from Florence. "You'll hurt yourself walking out of here." Florence grumbled into their ale. "Get me another drink and I'll think about it." Tom raised a brow as Florence immediately went back to nursing their drink. He reached for an empty plate and began to wash it instead of humoring them with a response. A few crumbs clattered into the sink below before water could wash them away. He mindlessly scrubbed the dish. Tom's mind slipped back to the problem at hand. Dazai Osamu was out now, evidently confident traversing Diagon Alley on his lonesome. For the first time since Dazai arrived at the leaky cauldron, he was out of his room. At first, Tom had thought he would be worried about such a thing, the demon student roaming Diagon Alley freely. Horrifying. But instead, all he felt was confused, because the Daily Prophet had demon students smeared across what must have been 100 different papers since last February. Hysteria buzzed around the inn for months following the first article. Even just a few feet to his right, today's paper proclaimed much the same. Having a position so central to wizarding student life, Tom had thoroughly read every one of those papers, and there was no doubt about it, reading them. Tom knew, everyone knew, Dazai Osamu was a monster, but Then Dazai had stumbled into his shop, friendly smile on his lips and a too heavy load in his hands. The boy had quietly requested a room. He had gawked over Tom's wandless magic and had played keep-away with a feisty owl. It could have all been a facade, Tom knew. The papers had certainly speculated as much about the boy, that he was some sort of deceptive, two-faced wolf in sheep's clothing. But Tom couldn't forget the way Dazai had frozen up reading the Daily Prophet article, or how his fingers had tensed up over the paper, crinkling up the edges under white knuckles. Dazai had looked almost surprised to see the news there. Then, with shoulders pulled back and smile gone brittle, the kid seemed to be physically walling himself off, as if Tom was the threat there, not himself. Perhaps it wasn't fair to say that Tom's latest problem was the murderer living in his inn. No, Tom would be lying if he said that. The problem was that the 12-year-old murderer staying in his inn was holding himself up in his room, and Tom was concerned. Concerned about a murderer. One who, for all accounts, was being slandered to hell and back in the papers. Tom should have no sympathy for someone like that. But here he was, cleaning a plate behind the bar and thinking just that. Self-defense, the kid had said, even though the media was saying the exact opposite. He was just a kid, so sue Tom for being a little worried. Tom's gaze traveled back to Florence. They had emptied their ale and were now looking rather forlornly at a mostly empty coin pouch. Tom frowned and fidgeted with the edge of the plate for a second, before deciding to voice his thoughts aloud. "Florence," he called. They jerked up after a sluggish second. "You work at the Daily Prophet," he started, parsing out his words carefully. "Do the journalists ever?" Florence raised a brow and rested their head on a hand. Tom took a deep breath. "Do they ever just make things up? To write about, I mean." Florence stared at him for a long moment. The wall clock ticked. Ticked, ticked. Suddenly, Florence burst into cackling laughter. Tom jumped. "What kind of question is that, Tom?" "A thoughtful one," he said with a huff. Again, Florence laughed. They spun their hand in a loose, drunken gesture. "I just work in the archives. You know that. No place for a drunkard like me upstairs. Can't see straight enough to write even a sentence." Tom carefully ignored the remark, knowing Florence's early drinking habits were at least half his own fault. Quickly moving on, he asked, "Do they keep records of all the old stories down there?" He paused. Then, remembering Dazai's request the other day, he added a hesitant, "Ones about the demon student?" "Sure, probably." Florence reached for their ale, lifted it to drink, then pouted when nothing came out. "All the published and unpublished stories go down there to collect dust. We all like to pile up the boxes and nap on them. At least they could admit to it," Tom thought wryly. He shook his head. He opened his mouth to ask something more, when the sound of bricks shifting suddenly tore his attention away. The wall to Diagon Alley creaked as the bricks moved open. On the other side, Diagon Alley came into view, looking busier than it usually was at this time of day. Lockhart's signing, Tom recalled with a frown. He wasn't fond of the man's flowery language, but enough of his customers waxed poetic about the author for Tom to understand the buzz. But it wasn't the crowd that snatched Tom's attention. Dazai Osamu hurried through the door. A stack of books in his arms indicated he'd just been at the Lockhart signing himself. Tom also noted that Dazai was wearing a sleek pair of black gloves. They must have been new as well, as Tom hadn't noticed them earlier that morning. Despite the boy's seemingly ordinary purchases, there was nothing casual about his entrance. Tom thought he looked to be in a rush. Dazai beelined directly towards his room, without even glancing in the bar's direction. His shoes pounded against the floor. "Kid," Tom called before he could stop himself. Dazai slammed to a stop, eyes snapping at Tom instantly. For just a second, the boy's eyes were wide and his lips parted, as if expecting something. Then his expression abruptly shuttered closed. A calm look washed over him. "Tom, I was just heading back to my room." "I can see that," Tom said, speaking slowly. He thought about the hunted look in Dazai's eyes, then asked, "Can I offer you some lunch?" Tom watched his expression closely, but all Dazai did was blink a few times as he registered the question. "No thank you," he said curt. Then he blinked, a small twinkle in his eyes that had Tom briefly staggering. "Oh, was I too noisy? Are you actually going to kill me?" "What? No," Dazai huffed, looking at once disappointed. Tom was baffled. Apparently dissatisfied, Dazai turned on his heel to start walking again. Again, before he could, Tom said, "It's just, you haven't come out for anything to eat since you got here. And, well, it's on the house, since you're staying here alone and all." And again, Dazai stopped dead in his tracks. He stared straight at Tom, a confused press now between his brows. Tom silently cursed himself. From Dazai's perspective, it must seem like Tom was doing a complete 180-degree. But in reality, the innkeeper had been thinking about the demon student's predicament for days now. This morning's encounter had only hastened his uncertainty. Still, there must have been a more tactful way to offer Dazai a tentative olive branch. "Hey, if the kid gets free meal, can I get free ale?" Both Tom and Dazai's attention snapped to Florence. They smiled crookedly at the barkeep. Dazai seemed to relax a little at Florence's interjection, Tom noted with relief. Something about the drunk's lack of class must have put him at ease. The boy raised a brow. "Isn't it a bit early to be drinking?" Florence huffed. "What, are you and Tom sharing notes? I don't want an intervention." "If you drink too much, then you might trip and crack your skull open on the way to work," Dazai told them. Florence choked on their spit. Equally flabbergasted, Tom coughed into his fist. "Charming kid." Florence recovered first. "Real charming. I'll need another drink to forget such cruel words." Tom shot them a glare before turning back to Dazai, who merely shrugged. "It's on the house," Tom reiterated. When Dazai didn't react except to watch him, he plowed onward. "An apology for my being a little, harsh the other day. I realize now that I may have jumped to a few conclusions." "Please don't take offense," Tom thought frantically. "I'm terrified of you but also worried about you, and why can't you actually look as scary as the Daily Prophet makes you out to be?" Dazai's outward expression didn't change, but Tom got the impression that the boy was scrutinizing him. The bartender couldn't help but feel like the assessment was warranted. For a second, Tom thought Dazai would agree, but after a pause, the boy shook his head. "No thank you." Tom deflated. It seemed his young charge wouldn't be budging today. The air left his lungs in one big heaving sigh. Relief or defeat? Tom wasn't sure himself. "But," Dazai said before turning on his heel to retreat to his room, "consider yourself forgiven. I suppose it can't be helped, if the Daily Prophet—" Dazai trailed off. With a surreptitious glance to the other patrons, Tom understood why. He didn't want it getting out any more than Dazai did that the demon student was currently rooming here. Dazai was fast, already halfway to his room when Tom called, "I'll bring you some supper tonight," and the door slammed shut. "If you want." He sighed. Or not. The barroom was quiet for a moment. Tom pinched the bridge of his nose, wondering just what sort of mess he was getting into. Just a week earlier, he would have told you the demon student was some half-mad serial killer in the making. But now, having actually spoken to the boy, Tom couldn't say anything with confidence. Hell, he couldn't even say the main source of magical news, the Daily Prophet, was reliable now, all because of one 12-year-old's pouting, bandaged face. Maybe he was getting soft in his old age. The Daily Prophet, Tom opened his eyes to see Florence, sloppy grin crossing their face. They lifted their drink, tilting it towards where Dazai had swiftly disappeared to. "Your sudden interest in my job wouldn't have anything to do with that kid, would it?" Tom stole the empty drink right out from their fingers. Florence squeaked and made frantic, grabbing motions to get it back. The barkeep didn't relent. "You're surprisingly astute for someone so drunk. It's a talent. Will you refill that now?" Florence keened. Tom glanced to the glass, then back to Florence. An idea tickled the back of his mind. "You don't have the coin. Or I can pay you back." "Perhaps," Tom started, slowly parsing out his idea as he spoke, "we can work out an alternative method of payment." Florence blinked once, then twice. They looked Tom up and down with slow eyes. "Get me the archive copies of the demon student stories." With pink cheeks, Tom hastily added, "in exchange for a free drink." The proposition hung in the air for a long moment. Then, "Just one drink? 2 if you can get it by tomorrow." "Ah," Florence sniffed. "2's too good to pass up. Doubt the boss will even notice 1 or 2 stacks missing anyway." Tom let out a breath, then nodded. "Then it's a deal." More quietly, he added, "Thanks, Flor." Florence waved him off. They looked to the glass, which Tom had started to unconsciously wipe clean, before seeming to sober up some. "The demon student, huh?" Florence muttered. eyes shooting to the inn hallway thoughtfully. Tom followed their gaze and held his breath. Wonder what's got you suddenly interested in a story like that. Just a thought, Tom told them. Aren't you going to be late for work? Florence grumbled. I'm already late for work, they puffed, shooting a glance to the wall clock. But I guess I can get there now, since there's ale on the line. Florence stood, hands bracing on the bar top for stability. Tom took pity on them. Here, he retrieved a chocolate bar from under the bar and slid it across the table. Shouldn't let your drink sit on an empty stomach. Now get out. Aye, aye, Florence huffed. They snatched the candy off the table before clumsily sulking to the brick wall. A sloppy wave of their wand opened the door. Florence slipped into Diagon Alley with all the poise of a drunken goose. Tom watched as the brick door closed back shut. Once it was sealed, he turned back to his work behind the bar. Although his eyes naturally came to spy down at room 4, he didn't let them rest there long. There was a sour feeling in Tom's gut. Hopefully Florence's bounty, when they returned, would clear things up, but until then, cleaning dishes and tables would have to keep Tom occupied. Whatever was really going with the demon student, Tom hoped the answers would be satisfying. Somehow he didn't think that would be the case. The curtains were pulled tightly closed, and the room was pitch black. A pile of half-read textbooks sat scattered at the edge of the bed, cast aside when Dazai's eyes had started to ache. Only Lockhart's books remained entirely untouched. Dazai had skimmed the first few chapters of Break with a Banshee only to stop there. It had become immediately clear that it wasn't really a textbook, so much as a list of reasons why Lockhart thought he was amazing. Speaking of Lockhart, Dazai now had an official declaration of war hanging over his head. He wondered if he could just ignore it. Lockhart didn't exactly seem like the capable type. Moreover, the man had practically shook in his boots every time Dazai talked back to him. Still, it was just one more thing to deal with on top of all of Mori's nonsense. This year was already shaping up to be a catastrophe. In spite of this, Dazai couldn't find himself entirely dreading it. His gang would be waiting for him there. Meeting the twins at Flourish and Blots had only reignited the warm flame in Dazai's chest. It was entirely unlike the cold, sterile world of Mori's office. Dazai flipped over in bed. He buried his head beneath the quilt. You know, attachments like that, Mori's words echoed in his head unbidden, have no place within the Port Mafia. Mori hadn't said the next bit, but Dazai's brain filled in the blanks automatically. If you don't belong in the Port Mafia, you'd be better off dead. Hoot! Dazai jerked out of his thoughts. Hoot! Featherbrain suddenly shook the room with another bellowing hoot. There was a ruffle of wings in the air, followed abruptly by sharp talons digging into Dazai's shoulder. Hey! Dazai squawked, pushing himself upright and toppling Featherbrain off of him. What's that for? Featherbrain didn't look at all told off, and she hooted again. Dazai scowled. I was only thinking, he grumbled, suddenly feeling trapped under those intelligent owl eyes. Don't you have better things to do than attacking me? Unsurprisingly, Featherbrain's responding hoots were entirely nonsensical. Dazai ignored her now, in favor of sitting up. He ran a hand over his face in some vain attempt to wipe away the dark thoughts there. Evidently pleased, Featherbrain hopped off the bed. Dazai didn't turn to watch her go, too busy rubbing his eyes. Blindly, Dazai reached around the bed. It was a few seconds before his hand found purchase on what he was searching for. He pulled the phone to his ear, dialing the only number saved without having to look. Dazai carefully kept his eyes closed against the item's harsh mechanical light. The phone line clicked. You didn't call yesterday, was Mori's greeting. Dazai frowned. He squinted at the phone. The white light blinded him for a second before clearing up. It was almost noon the next day. He hummed. I've been busy. He had been busy lying in bed and staring up at the dark ceiling, losing track of time. But Mori didn't need the specifics. How did your meeting with Lucius go? Mori asked, straight to the point. Fine. He hesitated. He brought his family. Mori hummed, seeming to consider the information. And? What did you learn? Dazai paused, remembering all the Malfoy family interactions he'd seen yesterday. Between their meeting in front of the bank to their departure in Flourish and Blots, Dazai thought he had a fairly good picture of the family's inner politics. Lucius is definitely the one you want to impress. If he gives an order, the others will follow. He recalled how quick Lucius had been able to shut down with wife and child when he wanted to. The wife, Narcissa, seems to just be going along with Lucius's plans. But she has a soft spot for Draco, he corrected himself. Her son. Static buzzed over the line as Mori considered the information. What of young Draco? Dazai bristled, but carefully kept his voice level. They don't tell him anything. I'd say they don't trust him, but I think it's more likely Narcissa just doesn't want him involved with the port mafia any more than necessary. That will make him easier to manipulate, Mori said, sounding impartial. He's already loyal to me. I won't need to push too hard for him to trust me more than his own family. Mori chuckled. It seems those cute little friendships of yours aren't entirely useless after all. Good work, Dazai. Dazai twitched at the praise. He was quick to push past it. You said Lucius might try to test me, he prompted. That's right. As far as I'm aware, the pieces of your test are already in motion. Take care of it quickly. The sooner Lucius bows to the port mafia, the sooner we can move on to more important things. Mori's voice had gone entirely clinical. From the other end of the line, Dazai could hear papers rustling around. Consider it done. Good boy, Mori purred into the microphone. Dazai could practically feel the man's words through the line, a too gentle caress of nail over his wrists. Gooseflesh. Now I have some important work to take care of. Try not to kill yourself in the meantime. Dazai opened his mouth to respond. Click. The line had already gone dead. Dazai's tongue was dry and cold in his mouth. He pressed his lips firmly together before discarding the phone with a flick of his wrist. It landed with a smack against the wood floor. Featherbrain dropped one of her dead mice by Dazai's feet. He eyed her for a long, long moment. There weren't mice in the Port Mafia headquarters. The entire building, from its penthouse suite to its midnight black basements, were sterile and full of a clean, well-intentioned malice. Even the dog kennels, which Dazai had always found to be near squalor, were actually quite well kept. Something about the Port Mafia being so pristine had always made Dazai pause. It caught in his breath and held his lungs still until he wasn't sure if he'd be breathing much longer. The Port Mafia shouldn't be clean, he'd always thought. That building and everyone in it was drenched in blood. The torture rooms were splattered with red day in and day out, but they were somehow the cleanest rooms in the whole of Yokohama, the only places in the whole world where people told nothing but the honest truth. Then those people would always die. And Dazai knew nothing was more honest than death. There were no rodents in the Port Mafia, but there were mice in London. There was a sly rat named Angel that wandered around Hogwarts half of every year. There were a dozen dead mice at the foot of Dazai's borrowed bed. The contradiction burned like nothing else in the world. Lucius was a rodent, Dazai knew. Someone who would burrow 1,000,000 little homes and keep every single one for himself. But a mouse could always be drawn out of their hole with cheese. All Dazai needed to do was to supply the metal spring trap and to find out what was sweet enough to Lucius to entice him out. The man was conniving and immoral, but he wasn't hospital clean like Mori was. Knock, knock, knock. Dazai barely shifted away from his thoughts. He angled his right ear towards the noise, but otherwise didn't react. By his feet, Featherbrain let out an eager-sounding tweet. Again, Dazai barely reacted to it. A rodent was entirely unclean to the core. Unclean and inhuman, just like "don't kill yourself," Mori had said. Knock, knock. The knocking picked back up. Did Dazai? A voice called through the wood, subdued. It sounded as though the speaker was trying to keep their voice low. It's Tom. Can I come in? Dazai blinked out of his head, slowly shifting to face the door. Only for a minute. I just don't think you'd want it to talk out in the hall, Tom reassured quickly. There was a sound as if Tom were shifting something heavy in his hands. Curiosity prickled at Dazai's chest. Are you awake? For another second, Dazai merely stared blankly ahead. Then, he shook himself. Featherbrain must have noticed his change in demeanor because the owl took to the air abruptly. She swooped across the room and onto the windowsill to watch with sparkling eyes. Dazai sighed at her antics before pushing himself to his feet. I'm awake. Ah, good, Tom said, sounding relieved. Can I come in? Dazai ran a hand across his face. As he walked to the door, he quickly snatched his new pair of gloves from the bedside table and pulled them on. They were a pair of black, dragon skin gloves he had bought at Madame Malkin's Robes for all occasions yesterday. They had been a last-minute decision, but a smart one, nonetheless. Sleek and strong, they wrapped no longer human up and prevented the ability from lashing out unexpectedly on passerbys. Dazai gripped a gloved hand around the doorknob and carefully pried it open by just an inch. He peeked a single chocolate eye out of the crack. Tom was just on the other side of the door, looking back and forth as if expecting someone to interrupt them. Dazai tried to make out a reason for the man to bother him now, but couldn't find one. "Tom," he said, snapping the bartender's attention to him. "To what do I owe the pleasure? If you've come to kill me, now is a good time, actually. I just had the most awful conversation I'd like to forget." There was a pause, an extended pause. Can you let me in?" Tom asked eventually. "I have something for you." Dazai frowned. He strained to see what Tom was holding, but their positions didn't allow for it. He thought the problem over for a second. What was the worst that could happen, letting Tom in? If the man really was a threat, Dazai would just have to stab him the same way he had Coil. It would be an unfortunate issue to deal with later, but Dazai would manage. Or, well, he could just let Tom kill him. Thinking this, he nodded. He stepped back and with little flourish swung the door open wider. "Ah, thanks, kid," Tom said, stepping through the door. Dazai shut it behind him. "The room is a bit of a mess," Dazai said, words apologetic but tone anything but. "I'll make sure Featherbrain cleans it up before we leave." Dazai didn't catch Tom's expression as he walked across the room, but the bartender did pause to consider those words. Featherbrain? He dropped something heavy down on the corner of Dazai's bed, then looked up. "Oh, your owl?" Dazai hummed. From her perch, Featherbrain hooted a kind greeting. Dazai waited a second by the door, pausing and assessing. However, it became clear abruptly that Tom wasn't about to whirl around and attack him. Dazai wasn't sure whether to feel relief or annoyance at that fact. But, momentarily assured of it, Dazai patted across the room to peer around Tom's shoulder. The thing Tom had dropped on his bed was a stack of twine wound newspapers. Garnished atop it was a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. It was a heaping serving, at least enough for 5 people. Dazai's curiosity won out over trepidation. He walked past Tom to squint down at the articles. It was a challenge with the lack of light, something that Tom also seemed to notice. The bartender made a gruff sound before carefully walking himself through the darkness towards the window. The first paper on the stack wasn't bound like the others. Instead, it seemed to have been added to the top almost as an afterthought. After a second, Dazai realized why. It was freshly printed and dated that morning. Bold capital letters were printed across the top, spelling out both Dazai's name and Lockhart's. Below that was a familiar scene from Flourish and Blots. Dazai's own image grinned devilishly back up at him. "The story broke this morning," Tom said, voice unsure. "Your face is all over Diagon Alley by now." Dazai sighed. It wasn't like he hadn't known this was coming. Still, it was an unfortunate turn of events regardless. Unwilling to dwell on it long, however, Dazai moved to the other stack. "The demon student ice coming for your child next," the top paper read. The cover photo was that of a chubby-cheeked crying child. Dazai frowned down at the blatantly false reporting. He noted with some aplomb, however, that the photo had not stopped silently sobbing yet. The animation spell was still fully intact. Gloved hands couldn't nullify spells. Good to know. "It's real nice out today, kid. You should open the windows." "Let me," Tom cut off abruptly before even reaching the window. "Is that a pile of dead mice?" Dazai jerked out of his readings. His head snapped up to where Tom had frozen in place. "Gifts from Featherbrain," he informed plainly, before turning back to the papers. Ineffectually, Dazai tried to rip off the twine bindings. It was too tightly bound for him to make progress. His wand was probably sharp enough to cut through. Suddenly, Tom bellowed out a laugh. Dazai once again jumped out of his contemplation to stare wide-eyed the barkeep's way. Tom apologized for startling him with a wave of his hand. "I had wondered whose owl was leaving those." "It's you, isn't it, lovely lady?" Featherbrain cooed when Tom gently scratched her beak. She preened under the attention, then obligingly hopped away so Tom could peel open the curtains. Immediately, light poured into the room. The whole room bled white. Dazai closed his eyes to brace against the blinding change. "Sorry." "She left you mice too?" Dazai asked instead of amusing the man's apology. He pried his eyes back open but scowled at the bleached spots that still lingered in his vision. Tom grunted and lifted the window open. A gust of fresh-smelling air gently ruffled Featherbrain's wings. Sure did. He glanced back to Dazai. Dazai felt his face go blank on impulse. Still, Tom must have seen something, because he calmly tacked on, "No harm done. Some owls are like that. Giving gifts to say thank you or I care about you. She's just being annoying. You'd know if you met her for more than a minute." "Obnoxious is her defining character trait," Dazai countered without pause. He looked around for his wand, wondering where he'd ended up tossing it to. Finally, he spotted it rolled over next to one of Lockhart's worthless books. Tom kept his distance, hands tucked behind his back non-threateningly. When Dazai picked up his wand, however, the barkeep instantly went tense. His hands twitched behind him. Dazai glanced at him, from his sweating brow to his shoulders held stiff. It seemed he still held some trepidation, after all. Dazai didn't comment, merely raised a brow and made a show of slicing the twine with the sharp point of his wand. The bindings fell apart over his bed. Dazai discarded his wand by it, and Tom let out a sigh of relief immediately. "Hogwarts students tell all. First-hand accounts of the demon student," the next article read. Dazai quickly skimmed through the page. He didn't immediately recognize the names of the students Skeeter had interviewed, though most of them seemed to be other Slytherins. Dazai caught the name Pansy Parkinson near the end of the article and nearly laughed. "Dazai is really bad news. I've been telling everyone that for ages," Pansy had told Skeeter, who in turn had carefully penned it into this Daily Prophet article. "Did you know he's awful at magic? I hope the professors don't welcome him back for a second year. How to tell if your classmate is possessed by a demon? Read the next article." The one after, "Is Dazai Osamu possessed by a demon?" Dazai's nose scrunched up as he flipped from one article to the next. "What is all this?" Dazai thought aloud. Tom answered, "The other day you mentioned wanting to read all the articles about yourself. I had a friend get them." Dazai set another article aside, then scowled at one titled, "The Cold-Blooded Killer Next Door." This was all hysterical nonsense. Not even one of these articles was slightly based in fact. The words self-defense never once appeared in the entire stack of newspapers, even in theory, let alone Voldemort or Death Eaters. The closest Dazai found was one article speculating he was a fan of you-know-who. The articles spanned across multiple months, and every single one was topped with the name Rita Skeeter. Finally, he came to the first paper in the pile, the secret behind Dazai Osamu's murderous rampage. He blinked down at the date. "This is dated from May." Tom cleared his throat, drawing Dazai's gaze. "That's all I was able to get," he explained. "For now. Florence will probably grab the earlier ones if I ask nicely." Florence. Dazai couldn't recall having ever heard that name. "Who? Your friend?" "Right, I never formally introduced the two of you." Tom didn't sound even slightly apologetic. If anything, Dazai thought he sounded sheepish at how the conversation was turning. "Florence is the drunk you met yesterday. Long dark hair, slurring all their words." Dazai nodded. "They work for the Daily Prophet. I asked him to grab the old demon student articles for me." Tom scratched the nape of his neck. At Dazai's unblinking look, he sighed. His hand dropped back to his side. "I skimmed through them all. Looking at them in retrospect, the whole thing seems a little silly. But when everyone is saying it, it's real easy to get swept up in the hysteria, I suppose." He scoffed and shook his head a little. "Demon possession." Dazai couldn't agree more. "How does Rita Skeeter get her information?" he asked, rather than dwell on a rising frustration. Tom frowned. "Not sure. Any other time I'd have told you interviews and investigations. But now." "She's just making things up," Dazai finished for him. Under his breath, Dazai asked himself the question that had been bugging him ever since he first arrived in the Leaky Cauldron. Why? Because that was the real issue here, wasn't it? What did the Daily Prophet stand to gain from demonizing him? From denying that the Death Eaters were on the move again? Dazai's eyes narrowed as he considered the conundrum. Someone with a lot of power had made the conscious decision to turn the wizarding world against Dazai. And despite himself, Dazai didn't think that obnoxious Rita Skeeter was the big bad here. When they had met, she had asked about the Death Eaters and Voldemort specifically. She had been prepared to actually write about it. Who was really in control of the Daily Prophet? Dazai asked himself. And what did they stand to gain from all the hysteria they were building? The expression on his face must have been frightening, because Tom's voice when he next spoke was somewhat shaking. Is it okay that I brought these? Dazai let out a deep breath and forced his expression to something more neutral. He looked to Tom. Thank you for this. Tom seemed to melt with relief at that. Then, growing more sure of himself by the second, he smiled. I brought you some food as well. Some hearty breakfast food, even if it's a bit later in the day. Dazai didn't spare the eggs a glance. Instead, he turned back to the scattered articles around his bed. Dazai began to methodically organize and restack them. He thought to rebind them, but the twine was unfixable now. Even if it's not true, it's nice to know what people are saying about me, Dazai told the man, tone purposefully subdued. He met Tom's eyes. Thanks for breakfast. Tom sobered up upon hearing this. I can't believe the Daily Prophet would just lie about this. They're the most trusted news source in all of magical society. Trusted things could be corrupted, Dazai knew. And anything with that much power would invariably have an agenda. Dazai just wanted to know how he fit into it. On the windowsill, Featherbrain swallowed a mouse whole. For reunion. Once the air between them was cleared, Tom became a surprisingly good host. Every day, 3 times a day. The innkeeper knocked on his door to deliver a meal. Dazai accepted every one, though more than half of the meals ended up in Featherbrain's stomach instead. Tom would start every morning off with the latest Daily Prophet served beside a warm plate of breakfast, which Dazai then considered in the privacy of his room. The articles were only becoming more daring. Skeeter had taken to calling Dazai an evil, manipulative villain type. Of course, this left Lockhart to be the people's hero. Dazai didn't know which moniker was worse. Tom was insistent that the slander and lies would eventually die down, but with each passing day he grew less sure. The lack of authenticity in the Daily Prophet was a heavy blow to the man. Dazai couldn't relate. Still, they got on well enough, even if Tom still balked every time Dazai casually mentioned drinking all of the inn's ale and dying of liver poisoning. When the day finally came for Dazai to leave for Hogwarts, Tom quietly saw him out the side exit. If you ever need anything, write, Tom said. Even if everyone else is against you. I've got your back, kid. Dazai nodded, already mentally cataloging what uses he might have for a bartender innkeeper. That reminds me, Tom said with a snap. Florence is still digging around the archives, when they're sober enough, that is. If they manage to snag any more old papers about you, want me to send them your way? Though Dazai wasn't sure how much use he would get out of them, he agreed nonetheless. If you could, give Florence my thanks. Course. Dazai shifted the luggage in his arms. Between books, robes, and Featherbrain, it was no easy feat. Tom seemed to take his discomfort as indication of the time. Well, you'd best be off. Hang in there, kid. It'll get better. He turned to Featherbrain when Dazai merely nodded. Goodbye to you too, little lady. Take good care of each other, okay? Featherbrain cooed happily, and Dazai had to grab the cage tighter to accommodate her shifting around. Thank you for your hospitality, Dazai said, curt, but to the point. The looming threat of walking through a bustling crowd had him eager to get moving. Off you get then. Tom grinned, brushing them off. Otherwise, you'll miss the train. Dazai dipped his head in a slight bow. Then, with a final goodbye, he turned from Tom and left the alley. By the end of things, Dazai thought, Tom hadn't been so bad. The man could be a little overreactive, but he had been helpful overall. So far, Tom had been the only stranger willing to look past Skeeter's outrageous claims. Dazai silently thanked Tom again as he pushed through the London crowd. Mostly keeping to the edges of the streets, Dazai tried hard to avoid the questioning stares of muggles. But with Featherbrain's constant cacophony of hoots and coos, it was nigh impossible. Dazai was only really able to relax once he'd pushed through the entrance at platform 9 3/4. The magical gateway burned at his skin painfully, but it was still a relief to pass to the other side. Surrounded by other wizards and witches, Dazai's luggage and owl didn't seem nearly as strange. No one gave Dazai a second glance as he beelined directly for the train to Hogwarts. Still, Dazai was careful to keep his head ducked behind his luggage. The last thing he needed was to be swarmed about being this so-called demon student. Thinking this, Dazai kept his head low. He boarded the train and jumped into the first empty cabin he saw. Dazai set Featherbrain's cage down with a thunk. Without further ado, Dazai plopped down into the seat beside her. He took a moment to stare quietly out the window before eventually deciding better of it. It was nice to see the students wandering outside. Dazai would never pass up an opportunity to silently observe his classmates, but he didn't want to risk drawing eyes. The last thing he wanted now was another incident, like the one at Flourish and Blots. With a sigh, Dazai gripped the pale curtains and swung them closed. It was inevitable, Dazai knew. Sooner rather than later, he would have to face the music. Skipping his classes to avoid prying eyes wasn't practical, even if it did seem more enjoyable. Professor Snape would hunt him down if he even tried. Shaking off the unhelpful thoughts, Dazai pulled a book from his luggage and promptly shoved his nose into it. The biology of magic was proving to be an interesting read. It also helped to keep his mind off of things currently outside his control. The impacts and interactions of magic on the human body are constantly under study, although more practical investigations, such as those into curse breaking and artifact handling, typically gain more media attention. This does not detract from the importance of study into magical biology. For instance, it is an observed quality that the practice of magic can increase an individual's lifespan. Compared to muggles, powerful wizards can expect to live well past 100 years of age. Bates, 1890, Grubb, 1940. Gaunt's 1776 research suggests this lifespan-altering quality may directly correspond to the wizard's magical sensitivity. Ms. Dazai read in silence, a contemplative frown pasted across his face. Magic and special abilities had very similar signatures, Dazai knew, but there wasn't an excess of literature on the topic of abilities. Did ability users also lead longer lives? Did magic interact the same way with their physiology? Perhaps Mori could dissect a few ability users as a test. Is this seat? Oh. Dazai was torn from his readings abruptly. His head snapped up to see two girls standing at the compartment door. They weren't changed into their school uniforms yet, but Dazai recognized them as being fellow Slytherin second years. Millicent Bulstrode, a harsh-looking girl who Dazai thought might enjoy fist-fighting for fun, and Tracy Davis, who wore her eyes and mouth like a hyena's laughing smirk. Silence lingered in the air. Dazai watched as their eyes grew wider and wider, until he wasn't sure they could look any more horrified. Then, with a frantic screech, they slammed the compartment door shut. Dazai blinked at the door. Faintly, from the other side, he heard hushed shouting. "Mealy, was that who I think it was? That the demon student." Damn. There went his peace and quiet. Dazai eyed the door with distaste. There wasn't a lock on it, and he didn't know any spells to keep it shut. Even if he did, it wouldn't be wise to try it unless he wanted to be rushed off to Madame Pomfrey the second the train reached Hogwarts. He purposefully turned back to his book. Mess, the innate ability to perceive and interpret latent magic, is a staple to be considered a wizard, and much like a fingerprint, cannot be altered throughout the lifespan. The book went on to read. Without the ability to perceive magic, it cannot be manipulated. Abbott, 1943, Jackson and Kama, 1980. Despite this, the practice of interpreting latent magic is largely theoretical and has no current reliable experimental basis. Notably, even the most incapable of muggles can sense some potency of magic. Bates and Calder, 1895, by using a sensing stone. What about this one? Dazai slammed his book shut, readying a glare at whoever had interrupted his reading a second time. Before he could, however, recognition stopped him short. Ron? Ron stared, eyes wide. He was wearing a long, baggy sweater emblazoned with a stitched-on R. Dazai recognized it as the one Mrs. Weasley had gifted her son last holiday season. Ron blinked several times before suddenly shaking out of his stupor. Hurriedly, he stepped into the compartment and slid the door shut behind him. Ron nearly dove into the seat across from Dazai. "You don't think anyone saw me come in here, do you?" Dazai glanced to the door. He raised a brow. "What? You don't want to be seen with me? I thought we were over those silly rules of yours." "Wah, it's not like that," Ron sputtered indignantly, but his eyes tellingly averted to the left. You're infamous now." He flailed. Dazai snorted. "It's good to see you again, too." Red bloomed across Ron's cheeks and his mouth snapped shut with an audible click. The tension in his shoulders melted. "It's good to have you back, Dazai," he grumbled. "Things weren't the same without you." "I bet Professor Snape missed having me around," Dazai said with a laugh. "Are you kidding?" Ron smirked. It was the first smile Dazai had seen out of him yet. For the first time in a year, no one was melting his cauldrons. I think he must have cried a tear of joy. Dazai breathed out a soft laugh, imagining that, though it was a little hard to envision the ever-serious Snape with a teary expression. Speaking of Snape, that was one Professor Dazai wasn't looking to reunite with. By the end of his first year, the potions master had taken it upon himself to dig his nose into places it didn't belong. Hopefully their few months apart had deterred any further desire to pry. Did I miss anything else while I was gone? Well, Ron, you shut the door on my face. A squeaky voice interrupted. A younger, long-haired version of Ron Weasley had her arms crossed and cheeks puffed out at the doorway. She had thrown it open at some point in an affronted haste. Ginger hair swept all the way down to her hips. Her sweater had a G drawn across it. Dazai remembered having seen the girl briefly at Flourish and Blots. "Ginny," Ron jumped. "You startled me. Get in here before someone sees." With a petulant huff, Ginny slammed the door shut behind her. She crossed her arms instead of taking a seat. Dazai looked between Ron and Ginny. Recognition lit his eyes. "Your younger sister, Ron?" He smiled at the girl, laying on the charm thick. "It's a pleasure to meet you, miss." Like flipping a switch, all the irritation in Ginny's expression bled away as she turned to face Dazai. He could tell the exact moment she realized who she was looking at. Dazai prepared himself for a fight, or screaming, or both. Ginny's eyes widened and her mouth fell open. Unexpectedly, however, she didn't scream or run away like the other students had. Instead, she steeled her shoulders. "Did Dazai, right? I've heard a lot about you from Ron and the twins." Oh, of course the littlest Weasley wouldn't be afraid of him. Her brothers were his most enthusiastic friends, and had been since day one. If anyone was going to believe he wasn't a demon, it would be a Weasley. Dazai gave a soft smile. It seemed to further put Ginny at ease as she finally uncrossed her arms and settled in beside Ron. "Only good things, I hope." Ginny giggled. "Only mischievous things," she corrected. Beside her, Ron rolled his eyes. "Ginny is too good." Dazai took her hands gently in his. "A proposition. I would be greatly honored to commit a double suicide with you." A beat passed. Then, "What?" Ron kicked Dazai in the shin. He dropped Ginny's hands without fanfare. "Speaking of the twins," Ron butted in. "Fred and George were pretty adamant about finding you, Dazai. It was their idea to search the train for your compartment. I just happened to find you first." "We just happened to find you first," Ginny argued. Ron didn't seem to be listening. Dazai crossed his ankles under the seat. Unless something drastic had happened, Dazai couldn't think of any reason the twins would urgently be seeking him out, which left only one possible explanation. Dazai nearly rolled his eyes but held back. Fred and George were on another one of their self-assigned older brother jobs again, it seemed. Instead of letting his admittedly fond exasperation show, Dazai changed the subject. "I don't see Angel with you." Both Ron and Ginny blinked at the non-sequitur. Ron, evidently used to Dazai's antics by now, recovered quickest with a shake of his head. "He's sleeping in my luggage." Dazai blinked. "You zipped Angel up in your suitcase? And you're always lecturing me about pet care." Flushing, Ron puffed out his cheeks. "I know more than you about it. Besides, rats don't require as much care as an owl does. Angel is just a sick little guy," Ginny told him. Dazai tried to recall if he had ever seen the rat ill, but decided he hadn't seen Angel consistently enough to actually be able to tell. Still, Angel was always too creepy-looking to ever seem the picture of health. He needs his rest. "Well, Featherbrain is as healthy as an owl can get," Dazai said, tilting his head to the charcoal-colored bird. She looked up from preening her feathers. "If you want to fuss over a real pet, you can start with her." A beam split across Ginny's face. Taking the offer for what it was, she leaned forward to pet Featherbrain through the bars of her cage. Featherbrain ate up the attention. "Her?" Ron asked. "You finally stopped calling your owl an it." Dazai shrugged. In all honesty, he wasn't sure what the reason was for the shift. He had spent the entirety of the last year thinking of Featherbrain as nothing more than an obnoxious pest. Or, on his worst days, an extension of Mori's long arm. But then summer break came. Dazai's days were spent in Father's room, in Mori's office, or wasting away in the pits of the Port Mafia's kennels. Everything there was empty and cold. It was nothing like the warm, if difficult to navigate, walls of Hogwarts. Nothing like the raucous mess of the owlery. Life in Yokohama felt empty, and compared to life in Hogwarts, Dazai was alone. Except for Featherbrain. Dazai shook the memories off, feeling they were too bleak to discuss with Ron and Ginny. Moreover, he didn't really understand the sentiment himself. Ron gave him an odd look when Dazai failed to explain. Luckily, Dazai was saved from having to reroute the conversation when the train kicked to life beneath them. A sudden surge of motion had the trio shifting in their seats. Unable to see out the window, Dazai could only guess at how quickly they picked up speed. Before long, the chug-a-chug of train tracks filled the compartment. "Ah, we're off," Dazai noted, leaning back. He folded his hands across his lap. Ron's eyes immediately fell onto the black gloves Dazai wore. He blinked at them, then very pointedly did not comment. Ginny spoke up in his place. "Ooh, I'm so excited." A little nervous, but mostly excited. At some point, she had pulled away from Featherbrain to brace against the seat. Now that the train was worked up into a steadier rhythm, however, Ginny was eyeing the owl once again. "Do you think I'll be Gryffindor?" "Weasleys are always Gryffindor," Ron informed her unhelpfully. She shot him a glare telling as much. "What's so interesting about Gryffindor?" Dazai asked with a glint in his eyes. As expected, Ron was already scowling in his direction. The boy was too easy to rile up. "Slytherin is perfectly nice, too." "You don't know anything about house loyalty, Dazai. Just because you waltz around the Slytherin and Gryffindor rooms like you own the place doesn't mean house distinctions aren't important." Dazai stuck out his tongue. Across from him, Ron's face was the picture of exasperation. Ginny, however, had her eyes turned away as she shifted in her seat. Oh, Dazai thought, she really is nervous. Worry about house loyalty wasn't something Dazai had ever partaken in. His only worry with the sorting ceremony had been about no longer human potentially nullifying the sorting hat's powers. Ginny's concerns were a bit simple compared to his own, but Dazai felt that he owed her a few kind words. The fact that Ginny hadn't screamed upon seeing him had come as a great relief. "I'm sure everything will be fine," Dazai told her. She jumped, head snapping in the mafioso's direction. "If you want Gryffindor, then you'll get it. If not, I'm sure I could talk some sense into that ugly sorting hat for you, Ginny." Just a wiggle of his bare fingers in front of the sorting hat, and it would be begging for its magical life after all. Otherwise, the option for a painless double suicide is always on the table for us. He cheered, this time quickly dodging another kick from Ron. Ginny blinked a few times before suddenly having to raise a hand to smother her laughs. "Thanks, Dazai. That was nice of you to say." She paused. "Well, most of it was. That last bit about suicide." Ron looked between them, bewildered. At that exact moment, the door swung open once again. "Hello? Is there a wee snaky in here? Or our kid siblings, perhaps?" 3 pairs of eyes turned to the entrance. Fred and George stared back. "Oh, hello, you two," Dazai greeted. "You finally found us," Ron intoned. "Took you long enough." Springing into action, Fred and George shut the door behind them and stepped forward in perfect sync with one another. Just like Ginny had, however, they didn't initially take a seat. "There you all are. Snaky, you got those bandages off. Good." Fred leaned forward to examine Dazai's face. He seemed satisfied with his impromptu inspection, but still didn't make to sit. Looking around, Dazai realized why. Dazai wrapped his hands around Featherbrain's cage, picking her up and setting her down by his feet. With the owl moved, there was now 1 seat remaining in the compartment. 1 seat and 2 twins. "My favorite twin can have a seat beside me," Dazai told them. A sharp grin poked at the edges of his face. "My second favorite can sit on the floor. I'll let you two decide for yourselves which is which." Fred and George shared a look. Then, without any words between them, they promptly squeezed into the same seat. Dazai scooted to the side as far as he could. Pressed up into the window, Dazai swatted Fred's elbow out of his face. "You love us both," Fred and George said together. Dazai rolled his eyes. Across from them, both Ginny and Ron were smothering their laughter. "Whatever." Dazai let out a not unfond breath. "Stop poking into me." The twins moved around as if to readjust, but the seat was just too small for 3. Dazai grunted when George stepped on his toe. "Sorry, Snaky. This is the best we can do." "Then sit on the floor," Dazai deadpanned. "Both of you. I'd rather share with Featherbrain." Fred and George laughed, but didn't move. Despite himself, Dazai didn't protest any further. Though he was feeling cramped, Dazai noted that the twins had, in fact, made an effort to give him space. Fred was practically sitting on George's lap. Once they seemed mostly settled, Fred turned to Dazai. There was an excited glint in his eyes. "We really missed having you around, you know. Ron here is no fun when it comes to pranks. He didn't even help us with our test answer key stealing scheme last year," George bemoaned. "Or with our plan to swap the labels on the potion supplies. Or when we charmed the infirmary pillows to explode and accidentally blew a hole in the wall. Or when, you two have been busy." Dazai cut them off before they could really get going. Fred and George nodded, faux serious. "Well, it wasn't all successful. Some of those were really more than two-person jobs, especially that pillow bomb." The twins shivered. "Madame Pomfrey really had it out for us after that one." Dazai frowned. "No one else in the gang had stepped up to help them? I'm not doing something with you that will get me expelled, especially not Madame Pomfrey. She's a beast when she's angry," Ron said. Beside him, Ginny rapidly nodded. Although she hadn't been a part of their group the previous year, she must have been very familiar with Fred and George's chaotic schemes. "Fill me in later on the details," Dazai told them. "Maybe we can give those plans another shot." The twins whooped. Ron looked utterly exasperated, but didn't bother to butt in. He knew a lost cause when he saw one, it seemed. Dazai considered asking the twins for prank ideas against Lockhart, but decided against it as soon as the thought crossed his mind. While he wanted little more than to torment the professor, it was probably best to lay low. What he had done at Flourish and Blots was already brazen enough. Beyond that, Lockhart hadn't made any tangible threat to him yet. Until Dazai got a better feeling for the man, he didn't want to retaliate. Especially not with this demon student title hanging overhead. The last thing Dazai needed now was people thinking he would kill Lockhart too. Not that he hadn't thought about it. The frustrated contemplation must have been visible on his face. "You're thinking too hard about something, Snaky," George said, leaning all the way forward to peer around his brother. "Yeah, lighten up." Fred kicked a foot out excitedly, accidentally smacking Featherbrain's cage in the process. A peeved-sounding hoot answered in return. "Sorry, Featherbrain." Dazai shook his head. He had a lot of things to worry about. The Daily Prophet's slander, Lockhart's declaration, the Malfoys. His laundry list of problems seemed to be never-ending. But there was nothing Dazai could do about any of it right now. For the time being, all he had to focus on was getting to Hogwarts. After that, he would have the time and ability to slowly chip away at his problems. Until then. "You two play Quidditch, don't you? Tell me the rules." Blaze did say they would go to a game together when they got the chance. It wouldn't hurt to learn a bit before then. When the train finally came to a stop a few hours later, Dazai knew all there was to know about Quidditch. The game sounded rough, messy, and a little bit too based on luck for his tastes. Why did any of the players even bother showing up if everything just came down to if their seeker caught the golden snitch? When Dazai voiced this thought aloud, each of the Weasleys gave him outrageously scandalized looks. "Are you serious?" Ron squawked. "I can't believe I'm friends with you." "Don't give me that look." Dazai raised a brow. Then, noting how eagerly Ron defended the sport, he asked, "Have you thought about joining the Gryffindor Quidditch team, Ron?" Ron froze up, not having expected the question. He laughed nervously. "Guess I've given it some thought." "You should try out," Fred and George exclaimed. They eagerly leaned forward. Between three Weasleys, the other teams wouldn't have a chance. Blood rushed to Ron's face at their enthusiastic support. He coughed into his fist. "Well, maybe." Fred and George chuckled, clearly taking great joy in their little brother's flustered expression. Ginny let out an exasperated breath. Dazai didn't understand what all the fuss was about. Maybe Quidditch was sort of like Hogwarts' houses, something people really cared about despite how idiotic it was. By the time the twins had finally smothered their laughter, the train had come to a full stop. Peeking out the curtains, Dazai recognized their destination as the train station. He also caught sight of a familiar figure. Tall, wide, and scraggly-haired, Hagrid stood just past one of the train's doors. A second later, when students began exiting, Hagrid called, "First years. Or here. We made it." Fred let out a long, weary sigh as he slumped over into George. Finally. As though the words lit a fire underneath the compartment, the Weasleys and Dazai went into motion. Fred and George detangled from one another in a flurry of elbows and knees. With one particularly brash jerk, one of those elbows smacked directly into Dazai's chest. Dazai was sure he would bruise. Sorry, Snakey. Across from them, Ron and Ginny snorted. They made no effort to help. Instead, they patted down their robes as they stood. A fresh pair of school robes hugged both of their shoulders. Ron's was topped with a Gryffindor red tie, while Ginny's had no such ornamentation. Dazai brought a hand to his neck to carefully fix the green and silver bow there. Unlike everyone else in the room, his colors were indicative of Slytherin. About halfway through the train ride, the group had split off to get changed into their robes. While the others had slunk off to the bathrooms, Dazai had stayed in the compartment to dress. He hadn't been willing to brave the potentially crowded hallways. The others had been accommodating. Fred and George had even helpfully offered to keep watch of the room while Dazai dressed. Now, a similar concern was rising up in Dazai. The twins seemed to read his expression. You want us to stand around you? Shield you from everyone looking? Dazai shook his head. Although it sounded nice to postpone the inevitable conflict. I'll have to confront it at some point. Better not to push things off. Anyway, a mafioso didn't cower, even when they thought it might be easier. The twins didn't look entirely convinced, but also didn't press any further. Dazai nodded to them. Then, without further ado, he opened the compartment door. Their belongings would stay behind to be magically gathered up later. With nothing more holding him back, Dazai took a deep breath and stepped out into the corridor. There were only about 5 people left in their train carriage. The second Dazai stepped out, their eyes all snapped straight to him. He recognized the 2 girls from earlier do a double take. Dazai pulled his shoulders back and lifted his chin. Confidently, her turned away from the eyes on him and walked straight to the exit. The telltale click of shoes on tile told him that the Weasleys were following. As they walked, people stared, mouths agape. If Dazai thought the attention would lighten up upon exiting the train, he would be sorely mistaken. For only a second, he faded into the bustle of Hogwarts students. Just another body amongst the masses, a nobody. Then, another student who had fallen into step beside Dazai looked over, met his eyes, and squeaked. They opened and closed their mouth rapidly, but no words came out aside from a stuttering, "Ew." Dazai very nearly slammed his hand over their mouth to shut them up. Before he could, however, Fred and George manifested at his sides. They each slung an arm over his shoulder. Grinning sharply, they stared down the other student. "Back off, kid," Fred said simply. "We're escorting our friend here to the carriages. He doesn't want any trouble." The student, a 3rd year perhaps, nodded frantically, evidently fearing some awful retribution for even looking their way. They proceeded to scamper off, stumbling over every other step as they ran. By now, quite a few curious eyes had been drawn to Dazai's little group. Whispers surrounded them. The twins remained steadfast, however. Wrapped around Dazai, they paid the watchers no mind as they pushed through the crowd. Whispers of the demon student followed them, terrified. Dazai let himself be moved along, ducking his head somewhat. It wasn't that he couldn't handle the crowd on his own. He had certainly done harder things in the past. But it was difficult to navigate confrontations at Hogwarts. While in the Port Mafia, Dazai could threaten bodily harm or even enact it. Here he was relegated to letting himself get backed into a corner, and he had to mind Mori's instructions on top of that. Making too much trouble would jeopardize the mission, wouldn't it? Or maybe not. Dazai needed to play his cards carefully, regardless. Dazai wouldn't say it aloud, but it was always a nice feeling to have the twins rushing to his side. After a second more of walking, he asked, "Carriages?" They'd moved mostly out of the train's crowd by now. It helped that, upon recognizing the twins' charge, people gave them a wide berth. 2nd years and upride to Hogwarts in carriages, Fred explained. They're pulled along by some invisible force. Dazai raised a brow. An animation charm? He asked, recalling the spell the twins used last year to make Ron's books fly. Someone cleared their throat. They're called thestrals. Dazai blinked, turning his head to follow the voice. Over him, Fred and George did the same. A young, bushy-haired girl smiled his way. "Hermione." Dazai's face split open into a smile. "Fancy seeing you here." She beamed, expressions soft despite the odd looks they were getting. "I'm glad to see you all again," Hermione said. She looked from Dazai to the twins, then to Ron, who had trailed behind somewhat. When her eyes landed on Ginny, she frowned. "Oh, I don't think we've ever met before. I'm Hermione Granger." "Ginny Weasley," she greeted with a small wave. "First year?" Hermione guessed, as though Ginny's small frame and wide eyes didn't make it obvious. "You'll be taking the boats then. Just over there." She pointed. Ginny followed her finger to where Hagrid was widely gesturing to something. Students had gathered around him like wanderers at sea to a lighthouse. Hagrid was certainly tall enough to act as one, Dazai thought amusedly. Instead of rushing off straight away, though, Ginny nervously shifted on her feet. "Go on," the twins said, giving their little sister a light shove. "If you're late, the boats'll leave without you, and you'll have to spend all year living with the wild beasties in the Forbidden Forest." Ginny blanched. Hermione tutted. "That isn't true, you two. Anyway, she would just ride in with us if something like that did happen." Ron nodded, though he didn't look particularly interested one way or another. Upon seeing the genuinely worried look on Ginny's face, Fred and George seemed to sober up a little. "Sorry, Ginny," they apologized. "There's no need to be so nervous, little sis. Yeah, we'll save you a seat at the Gryffindor table once you're finished being sorted. Off you go." Ginny blinked repeatedly before nodding. She looked a bit dazed. She said a hasty farewell before practically running off to find Hagrid amongst the crowds. It looked to Dazai as if the boats were already being boarded. If Ginny had hesitated any longer, she might actually have been left behind. Dazai took a step forward, eager to get the group moving again. After a second, the twins, Ron and Hermione, followed. "What's a thestral?" he asked. "If it's not a spell." Hermione shook her head, curls bouncing. "It's a type of magical creature. With all your research last year, I'm surprised you've never heard of them." Dazai shrugged. Outside of mountain trolls and dragons, magical creatures hadn't exactly been a priority. An invisible creature, huh? Good thing he had his gloves on. Dazai couldn't risk an accidental nullification with this many eyes on him. "Some kind of horse," the twins told him. "An invisible horse," Hermione clarified. "Actually, they're quite interesting." Supposedly, before she could finish speaking, the carriages in question came into view. The sight seemed to steal her breath away. Dazai himself froze in place as he looked over the carriage. Confusion pressed between his brows. The carriages themselves were rather lackluster. Dazai would hesitate to call them carriages, really. Rather, they were functionally large, black boxes attached to wheels. Some of them were already packed full of students, looking to be able to carry maybe 5 to each carriage. But what really captured Dazai's attention was the big black horses standing in front of them. They were massive, taller than the average horse. They looked sickly thin, no thicker than their bones. Their skin looked no more than linen stretched taut, ghastly. Huge black wings stretched out from their backs. Their eyes were pitch-black pools. "I thought you said they were invisible," Dazai said, brow pinched. The horses towered over the carriages, clearly visible. There was no question about that. When no one responded for a second, Dazai looked back to face the others. He was expecting perhaps the twins to be sharing a laugh, or Hermione ready with a lecture on her tongue. What he saw, however, was the gang watching him with wide, aghast eyes. Fred and George shared one of their looks. Ron looked to the Thestrals, then back to Dazai. He raised a brow. "They are. What do you mean they're not?" "You can see them?" Hermione asked. Then, with horror dawning over her, she looked pointedly to the ground. Guilt flickered over her expression. "Right, of course you can." Dazai frowned. Based on their reactions, Dazai was now sorely wishing he'd just kept his mouth shut. He turned to Hermione, silently asking her to explain. Ron seemed to be doing the same. Hermione wrung her hands together. "Thestrals can only be seen by," she shot him an apologetic glance, "by people who have witnessed death and understood it." Ron's mouth snapped shut with an audible click. Dazai frowned, the reality of those words sinking in. Oh. Dazai had seen death many times. People died in the Port Mafia every day. Jobs went wrong. Interrogations reached their natural conclusion. Dazai had led some of those interrogations himself in the past under Father's watchful gaze. How to hold the knife just right. How to make your words into a knife sharper still. Death in the Port Mafia, more often lately, was a pointless thing. Father ordered the death of his subordinates, seemingly at random, and waged war on unimportant gangs. As the man's mind slipped away, so too did his morality. So yes, Dazai had seen death, had held it in his blood-red hands and cradled it close. But that wasn't what Hermione was referring to now. It wasn't the reason the twins and Ron were watching him like he was about to break apart. Nor was it the reason other students kept shooting him subvert glances. Coil, the only person Dazai had ever killed out of nothing more than pure rage. Dazai shrugged off their stares. I guess that makes sense. Hoping to clear the air, he asked Hermione, how does that work? Biologically, I mean. Hermione blinked, startled. Well, no one really knows. She looked deeply relieved that Dazai hadn't reacted negatively after learning about the Thestrals' true nature. Thestrals are often viewed as bad omens, so most researchers aren't willing to get close to them. And that's ignoring the fact that many researchers can't even see them. Dazai hummed in interest, eyeing the skeletal horses as the group began to walk again. Hermione took the lead, guiding them towards an empty carriage, while the twins continued to send Dazai subvert, worried glances every few seconds. The Thestral leading this carriage was just as large and menacing as the others. Still, Dazai was careful to keep his hands to himself as he boarded. The Thestral kicked the ground nervously, but otherwise didn't attempt to run away from him. The carriage was just large enough to fit everyone in their group and no one more. Ron and Hermione oohed as the carriage started to move underneath them. Dazai supposed he might have shared in their enthusiasm had he not been able to see the mechanisms at work. Meanwhile, Fred and George merely watched with amusement. The Thestral started off slowly, but quickly picked up pace. Soon enough, it was galloping at full speed over the Hogwarts bridge. Dazai braced himself against the seat to the muffled laughter of the twins. We're going pretty fast, Dazai told the others. I might snap my neck if I jumped out right now. If Fred and George grabbed his arms tightly after that remark. No one said anything. Dazai peered out the side, where the first-year boats were slowly swimming to the castle. He was glad to have a private carriage this year, rather than a rocking boat surrounded by strangers. Dazai leaned back into his seat. All around them, Thestrals were pulling students along towards the main gate. With how fast the Thestrals could run, it was only a matter of minutes before they arrived. Dazai, Hermione, Ron, Fred, and George all hopped out of the carriage. The Thestrals needed no guidance. Within seconds of being unburdened, they spread their wings and flew off towards the forbidden forest. Dazai watched them disappear into the night with a contemplative frown. Thinking hard? Fred teased. Dazai turned back to his friends, then shook his head. Just looking. He tilted his chin towards where the Thestrals had disappeared to. Fred followed his gaze, unseeing. After a second, he seemed to realize what Dazai was indicating. His mouth dropped into an understanding, "Oh." As they walked through the gate to Hogwarts, Dazai was almost able to forget that he was public enemy first in magical society. There was an excited air buzzing around the school. Friends reunited, people happily chattered, and magic danced around them. Dazai and his own gang were doing much the same, laughing amongst themselves. He drew in a long breath of air, and the familiarly overwhelming buzz of magic turned in his lungs. It crackled and popped against no longer human. Dazai took a few more deep breaths before the sensation quieted to a more manageable dull hum. Here we are, Dazai thought, second year. Dazai waved goodbye to his Gryffindor friends as soon as they entered the Great Hall. He walked to the Slytherin table, eyes peeled for a sign of Draco or Blaze. The illusion of peace hanging over him shattered immediately. You did come back, a Slytherin growled upon seeing him. Demon. Well, there went his good day. Automatically, Dazai drew on a more suitable persona. I know, unfortunately, I didn't die over summer break, he said, raising a single brow. He went to take a seat. Not for a lack of trying, though. But before he could sit, someone put their arm over the seat, barring him from sitting. It took a second for Dazai to recognize Crabbe. Or was that Coil? Taken, the Slytherin grunted at him. I don't want to sit you with, meathead. Although he would like to sit somewhere, Dazai looked up to the next empty spot, only for the blonde-headed girl there to block her seat as well. Beside her, a ginger-haired boy did just the same. Dazai stopped in his tracks, as every single Slytherin made an effort to indicate, No, you can't sit here, Dazai. Some of the students turned away as they did so, looking nervously at the floor. However, more than half of the Slytherins openly glared at him. So this was how his year was going to be. Joy of joys. And to think he'd asked about returning to Hogwarts. Dazai was unsurprised to see that Pansy was among the students staring. Look who it is. The mudblood and murderer, Pansy sneered, when his eyes lingered on her for too long. You aren't welcome at our table, demon. Pansy. I'd say it's lovely to see you again, but that would be lying, Dazai said, expression blank. Then, with a raised brow, he added, You of all people should know that the situation was more complicated than the Daily Prophet lets on. She scowled, clearly uninterested in Dazai's rebuttal. Her lip curled, another insult poised on. Her tongue, but before she could loose it, her expression suddenly warmed. Draco, Pansy chimed. She sat up straighter and patted the empty spot beside her. Sit here. I saved this seat just for you. Dazai glanced over his shoulder. Just then, Draco walked out of a throng of other students. His back was ramrod straight, looking just as tense as he had when he'd been with his father the other day. Hello, Draco, Dazai greeted. He waited for a response. Waited. Except Draco didn't even stop to glance in his direction. Instead, he walked, chin up, straight past Dazai. He settled in beside Pansy without ever saying a word. Ah. Pansy gave Dazai a shit-eating grin. Dazai couldn't help the frown overtaking his face. Draco was acting as if he didn't even exist, when just the other day they had chatted like old friends. Dazai's eyes narrowed as he tried to make sense of Draco's 180. Meanwhile, Draco had tilted his head to the side so that his attention was fully on Pansy. Dazai's frown deepened into a full-on scowl. Okay, so he was completely alone this year. Should I just go sit at the Gryffindor table? He thought, fighting off an unwelcome wave of hurt. Or use my demon student title to threaten someone out of their seat. Only, he didn't need any more trouble. Attacking students might get him expelled. Course settle. Dazai turned on his heel. He tried to find one of his Gryffindor friend's eyes over the tables. Before he could, however, you can sit with me, friend. Dazai froze in place. The words prickled his ears, familiar and warm. His eyes immediately shot to the voice's source. It was easy to find. Every other Slytherin present also immediately locked on to the betrayer of their cause. Blaise. Blaise sat at the very end of the table, one hand pressed into his cheek and the other open in a small wave. His hair had been cut short, and he had gone through a somewhat noticeable growth spurt, but he was still Blaise. Dazai felt the ice rapidly cooling his gut melt. He invited himself into the spot on Blaise's left, ignoring how the other students shuffled away from them. With everyone giving them a wide berth, it almost felt like Blaise and Dazai had their own private dining area. It's been a while, Dazai greeted, cheeky. Blaise's lips twitched upwards. So it has. His expression softened. I'd ask how you've been, but Dazai followed his gaze to the multitude of glaring eyes faced their way. I'm not the most popular these days. Were you ever? Dazai snorted. You're killing your reputation by sitting with me. Blaise gave him a pointed look. I don't have a reputation. Besides, Pansy still likes me. Does she? Dazai lifted his head. Pansy was still sitting with Draco, chatting angrily about something to a few other upperclassmen. Her eyes flashed to Dazai, as if having sensed his attention. When Dazai wiggled his fingers in greeting, she mimed throwing up. It's hard to tell from your vantage point, but she can be quite friendly. Blaise paused. On occasion. Dazai thought that over, but couldn't recall ever witnessing Pansy act something even near friendly. He shook his head. I'll believe it when I see it. Blaise shrugged, nonplussed. And Draco? Blaise glanced to Dazai, then to the individual in question. He made a non-committal noise. He said you would understand. Dazai blinked in question. We rode in together on the train, he said by way of explanation. He told me that you would know why he was. He gestured vaguely to where Draco was making an effort to pretend Dazai didn't exist. The words washed over Dazai. He frowned, parsing out their meaning. Clearly, Draco had been vague on purpose. Moreover, he seemed confident that Dazai wouldn't take offense, which meant, I guess that's just how it is, Dazai said with a huff. Blaise raised a curious brow but received no answer in return. It was obvious, Dazai should have figured it out right away. Lucius must have given Draco some instruction to stay out of Dazai's way. If not that, then Draco was clearly trying to protect his reputation. Hanging out with the demon student could only bring negative attention after all. To the Malfoy family, associating with the demon student was akin to social suicide. Draco was protecting himself. He was protecting Lucius. Dazai leaned into his palm, a tired sigh escaping his lips. He cast a wayward gaze to where Draco was sitting. "Blaise, do you still have my knife?" When Blaise hummed, Dazai shifted his focus back to the other boy. Blaise patted his chest, where Dazai knew there to be an inside pocket. "Always," he said, matter of fact. "You aren't planning to stab anyone, are you?" A smile split Dazai's face. He shook his head. No, just wondering if you'd kept it." Blaise rolled his eyes, fond. "Of course I did, boss." Dazai smiled and rubbed a thumb over his chest. Blaise clocked the movement and gave a warm smile of his own. Before the conversation could go any further, the great hall suddenly went near silent. Dumbledore stood at the front of the room, arms out to quiet down anyone still chattering. Beside him, Dazai saw Professor McGonagall placing the sorting hat onto its stool. Near the wall, a line of first-year students were gathered, nervously awaiting their sorting. Dazai turned back to Dumbledore. "Welcome to another year at Hogwarts," Dumbledore announced with a booming voice. A few cheers rose up at his announcement. Notably, however, the Slytherin table was dead. Silent, tense, or maybe scornful. "Before we begin, let me first introduce our new defense against the dark arts professor, Gilderoy Lockhart." Again, the student body broke out into cheers and applause. Dazai stayed silent, eyes searching out Lockhart among the other professors. It wasn't hard to pick out the man's garish robes when he was looking. Lockhart stood and waved to his fans. Dazai noted, with no small amount of amusement, that Snape seemed to be glaring holes into the author's robe. Dumbledore continued to impart his wisdom onto the students, but it was nothing particularly interesting. Dazai largely tuned him out. He kept an ear open for any discussion of himself or Quirrell, but heard nothing. It seemed Dumbledore was still trying to keep that whole situation on the down low, despite everything. Frustration prickled at Dazai's chest. Not long after, McGonagall stepped forward. She held the sorting hat aloft and began calling students forward. Among the new first years, Dazai only recognized one name. "Weasley, Ginny." Ginny jumped when she was called. Then, taking in a deep breath, she strode across the stage towards the sorting hat. McGonagall set it down on her head. It fell down well over her eyes. The audience watched in silence for a short moment before the hat cried out, "Gryffindor!" Immediately, applause broke out at the Lions' table. Dazai caught sight of Fred and George, who had jumped to their feet with whooping calls. Ron, sitting beside them, had his head ducked low at the twins' antics. Still, Dazai noticed he was clapping loudly along with them. Ginny, a wide, toothy grin across her face, practically skipped to join them. The rest of the sorting passed without fanfare. The only other student to briefly capture Dazai's interest was a young boy carrying a heavy-looking Muggle camera in both hands. Given his recent experiences with flash photography, Dazai was only a little wary, but he was just as quickly drawn into his own private thoughts again. Instead, Dazai watched with lidded eyes, only coming out of his head when plates of food suddenly manifested in front of him. Blaise had already finished plating his food when Dazai finally reached out to serve himself. Blaise's eyes lingered pointedly on Dazai's small serving. Dazai stuck a crab leg in his mouth mulishly. When the meal ended, Dazai trailed behind the mass of Slytherins as they walked down to the dungeon common rooms. Although he chattered with Blaise on the way, it lacked Dazai's usual enthusiasm. He could no longer ignore the glares pointed his way. He couldn't look past the way his peers looked at him with unmasked fear. They were missing the bigger picture, Dazai knew. Blaise still walked amicably at his side, a monument to the greater plot between Dazai and Quirrell. But Mori and the Port Mafia stood at Dazai's back, a shadow that stretched for miles. It was a darkness that, even through it all, Dazai had yet to fully reveal to his Hogwarts friends. Only Draco knew of his involvement with the Mafia. And now, Draco was keeping his distance, refusing even to glance in Dazai's direction. And a mafioso shouldn't care, but if Blaise knew the truth about the everything, would he look at Dazai with those glaring eyes? Too? Would the twins? Dazai felt the hateful and horrified eyes of his peers linger on him, felt the animated portraits on the wall watch him from behind their watercolor prisons. The year had only just begun, and enemies surrounded Dazai at every turn. This place is really starting to feel like home, he thought with a grimace.
Thank you and subscribe for more Bungo Stray Dogs fanfictions. Let me know what was your favorite scene.